My name is Richard, I'm 25 years old, and in total I've been admitted to a mental hospital 3 times in my life, diagnosed with drug-induced psychosis. Today I am a symptom-free and genuinely happy man studying computer science at the University of Oslo, as well as playing guitar in a fairly successful folk rock band called Gangar. I want to share with you my story on how I got ill and on how I got well, as well as some insights following these events in my life. I'm making this video because my experience with psychosis is quite rare, given that statistically speaking, very few people get as ill as I got and get to come back to tell the tale. It's sort of like walking through a black hole and being able to come back and tell what's on the other side. I've always been very open and transparent about my experiences, even to people I've never met before. And the response I get is always very positive. People seem to get very delighted and even inspired by my lightweight and low-shouldered approach to mental illness. This is one of the reasons I've decided to make this video, in order to hopefully help someone else who is struggling and to contribute to loosening the stigma on mental illness. So what is psychosis? The best description I've ever heard of psychosis is that it's like dreaming in a waking state. This means that as much as you could have a nice colorful dream, you could have a horrible nightmare, all in which you have no ability to wake up from. Psychosis is often the predecessor to full-blown schizophrenia and often consists of symptoms like hallucinations, distortions of reality, and delusions of grandeur, meaning you think you are, for instance, the Messiah or God or something. I have personally experienced all of these symptoms. Quick disclaimer, I am in no way or form a professional psychiatrist, psychologist, or anything alike. Everything I say in this video is based on personal experiences and should only be viewed as my personal opinions. However, I do believe that my insights may be very useful to people suffering from similar diagnoses or to people who work in the mental health treatment facilities. I've set up a timeline in this video if you'd like to skip some parts. If you're currently suffering from a psychosis or anything alike, I'd advise you to skip to the part where I address how to approach your illness in case you have a limited ability to concentrate, as I personally did. I've also made a part on tips for concerning relatives and supportive staff, which might be interesting if someone you care about is ill or if you're working in the mental health sector. So let me start by telling you my story. I'm going to try to make my story as short and relevant as possible, but bear in mind that these events I'm addressing stretches over several years, and far from everything is included. I grew up in a wealthy part of Norway and had a very good upbringing. My family has always been loving and fair. I've had the best circumstances for a good life from the beginning. Since I was a kid, I've always been very curious, a little odd, and geeky. I easily got obsessed with things I get interested in, and I wasn't afraid to have opinions which differed from the majority. I took pride in this attitude, and I still do, but it's a double-edged sword. Despite this, I never got bullied or picked on. I wasn't super popular or anything, but the other kids seemed to respect me. When I was around 12 years old, I met this other kid who had just moved here. I got super inspired by him. He was the only boy who had really long hair, listened to rock, was controversial and funny, knew things the other kids didn't, and looking back, he was probably the most well-read kid in all our class. We became friends, and one day when we conversed, he told me something very intriguing. Richard, did you know that cannabis is not as dangerous as your parents and the government has led you to believe? Just look it up on Wikipedia. I did not know this. Surely he was pulling my leg. But lo and behold, after a quick Google search, this 12-year-old's trust to the government and his parents had gotten a serious crack in his protective barrier. I was stunned, and this was the beginning of a new curiosity. What else were they hiding? I never did any drugs until I was about 15 years old. Until this point, I had always been a very good boy and did everything I was told. However, ever since that conversation, I knew that I wanted to at least try cannabis once. A lot of hormones had begun to kick in as well during puberty, and I was in the process of slowly ripping myself away from my parents. I was a little tougher in my responses, wanted to stay out later, and was very eager to party and drink alcohol. This lust became more and more prevalent the months to come, as especially in this area that I grew up in, there was a lot of partying and underage drinking, and you didn't want to miss out. After slowly developing a turbulent relationship with my parents, I eventually ended up trying and even later smoking cannabis on the regular. To me, I didn't see any danger in consuming cannabis, and little did I know that the small percentage of people who may get induced psychosis from it was concerning myself, but more on that later. I used my ability to attain and prepare cannabis as a way of gaining popularity by the cool kids in high school. My behavior was extremely concerning for my parents, understandably, as I was becoming more and more apathetic and off path to a healthy life. Long story short, My cannabis use resulted in addiction. I dropped out of high school, became a cannabis dealer in order to maintain my high consumption, and the relationship to my parents and the government was worse than ever. At this point, the alienation and resistance I met from my choices created an even greater gap between me and civilized society, and I became more and more rebellious, conspiratorial, and paranoid. At this time in my life, I was about 16 years old. I consumed cannabis daily and was very into meditation, spirituality, the powers of the mind, and conspiracy theories. Without knowing it, I had slowly begun to develop a psychosis and losing grip of reality. Like I said earlier, my parents did everything they could in order to get me back on track, but the situation was very difficult to handle. Do you call the police on your own son? What help will that do? I was way too functional that the thought of a psychosis had even entered our imagination. We had no idea. About a year went by with daily cannabis consumption, conspiracy theories, and meditation. This was my recipe for the first psychotic outbreak, which happened the 29th of May 2014, which ironically enough was on Ascension Day. My experience of reality was severely altered, and I was conscious of it. However, I didn't know it was a psychosis. After all, I didn't even know what a psychosis was. I was certain that this was my spiritual practices and meditation which had finally paid off, and that I was reaching enlightenment. My parents knew that something was off that day, and thought I had taken something stronger than cannabis. I had not, and we ended up fighting, and I left home with anger and distrust. Later the next morning at 4 a.m., I got arrested by the police for refusing to give identification and possession of cannabis. When left at home by the police, they told my parents that the high would wear off during a night's sleep, but the next day I was admitted to a mental hospital for the first time in my life at an age of 16. Things were not looking good for me. In total, I was hospitalized for over a whole year, and during some of that time I was committed by force, meaning that I was considered a threat to myself or others. I was so ill that at one point one of my psychologists told my family that there was a high probability that I would develop permanent schizophrenia and that they would have to learn to live with a schizophrenic son. Miraculously, about 6 to 7 months in, I realized that I was sick. This recognition of my own sickness was crucial for slowly turning my mind back into place. After months of rehabilitation, treatment, and medications, I finally became functional again. I was by no means completely symptom-free, but I had been given a new chance to slowly rid myself of delusional thought patterns and to get back to a good path of life. I did half a year of work training at Modus Arbeidstrening in Asker, which was a fantastic opportunity for me to get some routine, discipline, and a little income that was legitimate in my life. After being there for half a year after getting better each day, I then picked up my education where I left it at a new high school, Oslo By Steinerskole, where I completed my general education high school degree in combination with a musical degree. I had been recommended this school from multiple directions, being told that this school would be perfect for me because their educational style is based off Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, where you learn from a more creative and spiritual perspective. And boy, were they right. I thrived at this school more than I've done ever before in my life. It was a true blessing. I left the school with almost only perfect A's and a whole new set of skills and knowledge that I am very thankful for to this day. However, during the attendance of this school, I got my first serious girlfriend and my first serious breakup. This was devastating for me, and I managed the situation very poorly. I eventually started smoking again and got into bad habits. Luckily, this didn't stop me from completing my degree, but it could have been a very close call. My friends and family were very worried once more. The finishing blow for my second hospitalization was 2 consecutive high-dosed LSD trips the same summer I had finished high school. You would think that after having been through my first psychosis that I would never touch any of that stuff again, but at this point I was so heartbroken and at a low point in my life that I didn't really care if I got permanently ill or even died for that matter. I had never done any psychedelics in my life before, only cannabis, and my experiences with LSD were astounding. The impressions I got from the trips were too much to handle for me, and they started interfering with my sleep. After a few days of not getting enough sleep, I started to recognize some old symptoms. At this time, I was about 20 years old, and I admitted myself in August 2018. This hospitalization lasted for about half a year. My symptoms were not as bad as last time, but I was having a really bad time. The hardest part this time around was the crushing depression I met after beginning to get well again. Almost everyone who gets out to their psychotic thoughts are met with a severe depression at the end of it because your everyday life goes from being extremely sensory stimulating to being completely stale and grey. On top of that, you feel like you have wasted so much valuable time that you should have used to develop a good life for yourself. I felt useless and that nobody would ever want to be with me again. After getting out of this admission, I decided I wanted to try to get a higher degree in music. I was invited to play guitar in a band with some close friends of mine, and things were starting to look hopeful again. We played several gigs and had a blast, and I got into the school I had auditioned for. Unfortunately, this joyful relief from my negative thoughts led me to start smoking cannabis again. With addiction, it's very normal to relapse in days of sorrow or in days of joy. In this case, it was in days of joy. My mental health was actually not too affected by this relapse, however, understandably, my family couldn't bear it. They'd seen their son so viciously ill before because of this behavior, and there was no way they could support it. They told me that either I quit or I move out of their home. I chose moving out. This was an emotional strain for both of us. Either side thought they were in the right. Obviously, they were, but I was in denial and made the discussion a broader political issue than of my personal health. I moved out by myself and studied music performance at Høgskolen Kristiania in Oslo, while simultaneously working almost full-time at a grocery store in Asker. I worked non-stop, either studying or working, and between every break I got, like traveling back and forth, I took the opportunity to consume cannabis. I was extremely productive and hardworking while being more or less constantly under the influence. Things were actually not that bad, and the distancing from my parents made our relationship even more stable. However, I bet they were under serious stress from worrying what might happen. In October, I decided to do a whole month sober, no substances of any kind, whether legal or illegal. This is something I do every October to this day. After just some days in, I felt much better, had way more energy to spare, and my head felt lighter. Obviously, my family was delighted. When the month was over, however, not only did I return to consuming cannabis, but I also consumed some psilocybin mushrooms on the initial days of November. The cannabis I had gotten my hands on were some extremely potent vape pens with THC levels up to 80%. I had tried psilocybin mushrooms once before and had a great experience. This last trip I couldn't seem to land from though. Since I was living alone, I was isolated with my own thoughts after tripping, and I really needed someone to vent my thoughts to in order to process my experience and get some much needed sleep. No one seemed to be available, however, and if I talked to someone like my family, I feared that they would only project that my psychosis was back. 4 days went by with barely 3 to 4 hours of sleep each night, and my mind was slowly starting to deteriorate. In desperation, I had to call my parents and told them I was getting ill again. I think a part of them were sort of happy because for them this was what they always knew would happen. It was hopefully a final "I told you so," which would leave me no choice but staying to their advice. I think they will disagree with me on this stance, but this is how I feel about it from my point of view. I admitted myself voluntarily the third and hopefully last time in November of 2019. I felt like I had hit rock bottom. This admission lasted for about 3 months, but it felt like there was no point in trying to get up again. I had wasted so many precious chances, and now I was too old and a wasted opportunity. I told you the last depression was harsh, but this one was way more intense, but thankfully didn't last as long. My thoughts about myself were abysmal, and suicide was on my mind daily. What saved me was the skill set I had gained from prior years of experience, so I rather quickly developed a healthy routine for myself. I worked out frequently, I wrote and played music, and I started writing my thoughts down. I wrote a lot, trying to get my mind in order, and I did the Future Authoring Program by Jordan Peterson for mapping out an ideal and bearable future for myself. My closest friends and family were supporting me the whole way, and I quickly gained confidence again. I even met a new girl and got invited to play in the band I play to this day, Gangar. This was during the lockdown period, and you would think that it had an extremely negative impact on me, but it was actually quite the contrary. I used this time to focus on myself and learn a new set of skills with 3D modeling and picking up where I left with computer programming as a teenager. Trying to wrap this story up, we're quickly nearing the present day, and my routines, discipline and contemplation has led me to a very fulfilling, happy life with an exciting future ahead. I am completely free from illicit drug use, and all my symptoms of depression and psychosis are as good as gone. The success of the band Gangar has skyrocketed since its infancy. It started out more or less as a joke to becoming a fairly well-known brand in the folk community and traveling Europe playing gigs. We released our first EP at the end of 2022, and we are currently in the process of recording our first full-length debut album. We're going to the US in February of 2023, which we're really excited about. Besides playing in Gangar, I studied programming and computer science at the University of Oslo, and I'm a music teacher and band leader for kids in my local area. In my darkest days, I would have never thought I'd ever be able to get myself out of my own rut. But miraculously, here I am, which I am forever grateful. Now, after telling my story, I would like to first address any of you listening who might be suffering from any of the issues I've described earlier. The first and most important step to your recovery is realizing and admitting to yourself that you're not well. This can be very difficult because when you're in it, it doesn't feel like you're the one ill at all, but that everyone else is. Try to be pragmatic about the issue. Is this state serving you? Is it possible that you're the one standing in your own way? Realize that there is an external world that you have to relate to somehow. To me, this approach was very useful. It didn't really matter if I was Jesus or God. I still had an external world in front of me that I had to relate to somehow and deal with. The way I was dealing with it during illness was not making my life any better. This is actually a very cool realization, knowing that there is an external world which doesn't budge to your perception of it. You must orient yourself to reality, not the other way around, and that's a good thing. This means that you can master the rules of the outside world and play to your heart's content. It requires a lot of practice and discipline, but the reward is beyond worth it. Life is a gift with many treasures. You just have to learn to play by its rules. There are some fundamentals of mental health you must take care of in order to have a chance of defeating your illness. These fundamental pillars are physical activity, sleep, stress management, and nutrition. Personally, I would also add creative and social outlet, but the ones mentioned before are the most vital ones. All of these pillars should be addressed through the method I'm about to describe. Routines. A lot of mental illness is fighting addictive thought patterns. Our mind is wired in a way that amplifies certain thought patterns and behaviors based on neural circuitry and our reward system. In a lot of mental illnesses, dysfunctional and negative thought patterns and behaviors have been strengthened to a point where you no longer have control over them. You get physically addicted to them. The best way to defeat any addiction is by replacing them with healthier habits or routines. In a way, a routine is just a healthy addiction. It's something you do every day or ever so often until you meet a point where you don't even have to think about it. It's hardwired into your system. So as I mentioned, your routine should consist of activities which meet the needs of your fundamental pillars of mental health. Here's an example of a day of my routine, but remember that your routine doesn't have to look like mine. You need to implement these routines with realistic, incremental steps for the improvement of your health so they last. Point 1. I wake up 8 in the morning and eat a bowl of oatmeal and take my supplements and/or medication. This covers nutrition and sleep. A side note on sleep. The consensus of the best way to approach sleep deprivation or bad sleeping habits is consistently waking up at the same time each morning no matter how much sleep you got the night before. This forces your brain to adapt to that waking point, and at some point you will get sleepy at the appropriate hour of the night or evening and get the hours of sleep required. Point number 2. I go to the gym, go for a run or take a walk. This covers physical activity. Remember, this doesn't have to be something hardcore that you're too uncomfortable with. Incremental steps is key. Going for a walk once a day is infinitely better than sitting all day. It's all about getting your body in motion. Point 3. Eat a protein-rich lunch, preferably with someone. This covers nutrition and the social outlet. Point 4. Playing guitar or listening to music. This covers stress management and creative outlet. This is my sort of meditation where I find peace and balance. It could be anything that makes you calm and centered. Point 5. Eat a healthy dinner with friends or family. This covers the nutrition part and the social outlet. Point 6. Get ready for bed at a reasonable hour so you get at least 8 hours of sleep before waking up again the next morning. This covers sleep. If you follow your routine consistently over a decent period of time in combination with consultation with a professional psychologist and treatment, I can guarantee you that your mental well-being will improve. All while doing the above, it's important you have someone to talk to who you like talking to and who cares about you. It's not a given that everyone has this, and maybe it's even because of loneliness that you've ended up with your suffering. In this case, my only advice for you is try to stay as strong as possible for as long as possible and focus on yourself, and at some point you will hopefully meet someone you can talk to. Now, try to be optimistic about your circumstances. Oscar Levant once said, "There's a fine line between genius and insanity." I believe this is true, and there are strengths to harness from the minds of people exposed to mental illness. Joseph Campbell once said, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight." Your unique experiences are valuable. Your mind is very likely highly creative and artistic, and you can use these abilities to your favor. The only difference between an insane person and an eccentric person is their ability to function in society. If you get your health and surroundings in order, you have a good opportunity to do something great with your life. Find your passion and express yourself with the gift you've been given. Being a close relative to someone severely ill of mental illness is no joke. In many ways, you are the biggest victim, much like the people who are left behind after a suicide are the biggest victims. When I was ill, I know it took a big toll on my family, and I felt extremely bad for my mom especially, more than I felt bad for myself. As a relative, you must have patience and take your own health into consideration. Gaining trust from the patient should be one of the highest priorities for both relatives and medical staff during a healing process. The patient is in an extremely vulnerable position with unbearably many delusions, and your only hope to untangle these delusions is by gaining trust and letting them talk freely about what they think. For example, it's very common for psychotic patients to think that other people can hear what they're thinking. If the patient has no way of letting you know that that's what's going on in their head, they will only respond in ways which correspond to what they just thought, which will make no sense. This can create extremely confusing situations for everyone. Try to create a space where there are no wrong ideas or thoughts. Make an environment where the patient speaks out as much as possible, in order to hopefully expose some of their delusions to you and themselves. Imagine what it's like to be them and try to put yourself in the patient's situation. Even though a delusion seems utterly ridiculous, to them it's completely real. If you believe in something 100% with your whole body and mind, your perception of reality will distort in order to align with that belief. This is something I have experienced on numerous occasions and is a very fascinating phenomenon of the mind. Don't get moral or political about the issues surrounding drug use. If a patient has taken drugs and gotten ill from it, it's almost guaranteed that they were in a bad place trying to escape from reality somehow, no matter what they say to themselves. Avoid these moral and political disputes. They are not serving the patient's treatment. Be kind and forgiving. Realize that when someone is severely psychotic and ill, they're not themselves. They might do things they never do in their right mind, so don't take it personally or keep them too accountable for what they said or did. We do not hold psychotic people accountable in law for the very same reason. Here are some of my final thoughts. The laws and culture on drugs today are making things worse. As I mentioned earlier in my story, the propaganda and fear tactic approach to drugs counterintuitively created more curiosity in me than keeping me away. I think truth and transparency is our best approach as a society to tackle the issue of drug abuse and addiction. In my case, I wasn't even aware of the potential risks of mental health issues attributed to cannabis and psychedelics. These very real threats should be addressed in an objective manner, as well as describing that many of these issues occurs not because of the drug itself, but in combination with our social conditioning and culture. For instance, indigenous people have had very long tradition of using substances in rituals where people having similar symptoms of a psychotic person would not be viewed as being mentally ill. This anthropomorphism of drugs, making these objective chemicals and molecules into some criminal actor in society, is an insult to our intelligence. It's human psychology and actions that is the issue, not the drugs themselves. We should approach the issue at the source, that is, the mental well-being of any potential addict, in other words, all humans. All drugs and chemicals have enormous opportunities as tools and technology in medicine, and it's a shame we dismiss the positive qualities of certain substances in the fear of abuse and addiction. In particular, there's a huge potential for psychedelics in mental health. This might come as a surprise for you, given that my whole story is about getting ill from psychedelics, but there's an upside to this drug that I want to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, most mental health issues goes hand in hand with addictive thought patterns and behaviors. Psychedelics has the unique effect of breaking up hardwired neural connections, giving room for new connections. I'll quote Michael Pollan.
There's a wonderful metaphor that someone I interviewed for the book said. He's a Dutch neuroscientist. And his image of what psychedelics do is like, imagine a hillside covered in snow, and imagine your thoughts as sleds going down that hill. Over time, the grooves created by those sleds get deeper and deeper. And over time, it's impossible to go down that hillside without falling into those grooves. They're attractors. They'll just suck you right in. What the psychedelic experience does is it's like a new snowfall, fresh snow. It fills all the grooves, and that allows you to go down the hill in a new way. That was a beautiful image.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Let's end with that.
And in some progressive states in the US, successful treatments of PTSD, fear of death, and addiction are being facilitated right this moment. However, I think it's very dangerous for individuals to try to treat themselves without professional and legal consultation. So many people, especially young people, are desperate for ways out of their mental health issues, and in their personal online research, they might easily discover the hopeful results of psychedelic treatment. Bear in mind that the success rate of some of these treatments are 80%, which is astonishing in the world of mental health. Trying to treat yourself with these substances without any experience in an environment where they're illegal is a recipe for disaster. And some people like myself are prone to drug-induced psychosis or even schizophrenia and should not be exposed to these substances at all. And our best way of filtering these individuals is through professional psychological evaluation. I want to reiterate why I'm making this video. I'm making this video to structure my thoughts surrounding my experiences in a formal manner in order to reflect upon them for myself, and in the process hopefully help someone else who has or is dealing with similar issues. I would highly recommend everyone else to write down their own thoughts and experiences in this way to properly align your train of thoughts and perceptions. I also want to spark discussions concerning the approach to dealing with mental health on an individual and societal level. If you disagree with me on any point, you are very welcome to share your thoughts in the comment sections, so we can have a healthy discussion in order to get closer to the best solutions to these issues. As a final point, I would like to emphasize the importance of kindness and emotional support. If it wasn't for my great supportive family and friends, I probably wouldn't have been here today. Everyone is dealing with something, but we often don't realize that they do. Take care of yourself and look out for others if you have the capacity to do so. Listening to others with compassion and lending out a hand can do a lot. Thank you for watching and listening to this video. Feel free to share this content in any way or form you'd like if you think it might help someone else or you want to share it for any other reason. If you would like to check out my music and art, go to my YouTube channel and watch my other videos, and go check out my band Gangar with the links in the description. Life truly is a gift and everyone should have the opportunity to experience its wonders. I guess there's a lot more I could say, but this will suffice for now, so make sure to give your feedback if you want to hear more. Much love, Richard.